Back to today's video. Today is Thursday, October 10th, 2024, and today we're going to be taking a look at a 2024 election prediction between Vice President Kamala Harris, I'm writing in her name right now, into the candidate numbers here, the candidate edit box, because I actually started this video a little bit too early, so we're going to go ahead and act like this didn't exist and that we're back to where we were originally. But a 2024 election prediction between Vice President Harris and former President Trump, as we are less than 1 month away from the 2024 presidential election. Now, I'm sure you've been watching on the mainstream media and on social media and all of these different avenues where you can get the news and discuss politics that this election is close, and it has been close for quite some time. The 2024 cycle has never not been close, might I add. It only was in the time after the Biden-Trump debate that Joe Biden started to lose significant ground in battleground states since that debate performance on CNN that took place on June 27th that eventually led to July 21st when Biden dropped out of the race entirely. And that was because there was a whole number of arguments being raised that Biden just simply wasn't the candidate to meet the moment and win the election. But now, Kamala Harris is certainly in a much better position than President Biden, but nonetheless is in a competitive one that will be really interesting and will likely lead this election to be decided in the days to follow November 5th, 2024. Now, the election cycle that I think also we have been watching very heavily on this channel was the 2022 midterms. We remember how those midterm cycles didn't actually line up with what the major experts were saying about the races. My own prediction was off, and many of the forecasting sites just simply didn't get things on the money like they had in previous elections, and 2022 had challenged the notion that the elections always underestimate Republican support. In 2022, they overestimated Republican support. And it was the first election since the Dobbs decision which revoked Roe v. Wade, reversed Roe v. Wade, put it back to the states to allow abortion bans to take place across the United States. And so we are now in our first presidential election with a whole wave of different topics that have been, really up for discussion in our presidential debates. We have housing, immigration, abortion, all of these different things, student debt relief, now, hurricane response, and all of these different things we are now seeing come to the forefront of the minds of voters in this election cycle. And it's been quite a wild ride, if you ask me. On the presidential level, we've been doing these forecasts for quite some time. We've been looking at the change in the state of the race in a number of these battleground and safe states, arguably, over the past couple of weeks and not even weeks, really months on the grand scheme of things. We used to do them every month, then it became every 2 weeks, and now it's sort of on a weekly basis. I decided to hold a little bit off after the, 1 week after because or 1 month before Election Day, I did a lot of conversation around the polls, the current state of the race on FiveThirtyEight, all these different areas for the cycle. Decided to take a bit of a step back. But now we're getting into that 1 week time frame. We're in 7 days time. We'll make another video, 7 days time, another video, and then 7 days time, another video, and then one right before Election Day. We're getting to the final stretch. And these numbers really haven't changed in a way that has been pretty substantive over time. A big reason for that is because this election cycle, as I said very early on, has always been quite competitive and has never really been in a position where it's less than that. And so what that really means for us on, when it comes down to how we're predicting the election, how we're predicting Trump's margin, Kamala Harris's margin, it all does come down to these swing states rather than any of the states I'm currently characterizing, which are our safe states for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And you can see that these fill out states like Montana, states like Kansas, states like Arkansas. These are traditionally safe Republican states. Democrats have California, they have New York, they have Illinois, safe Democratic states. And so as we get through these states, we're really narrowing down to some of the more competitive ones that are not as safe for the Republican Party. So Donald Trump at 113 electoral votes, Kamala Harris at 181. This is generally how Democrats and Republicans start. Again, the maps did not fluctuate too much because this election being close, Biden was always in a competitive position in swing states. Trump was always in a competitive position in swing states. And it doesn't feel a lot like 2020 when Biden was running up the margins. Biden had a much clearer advantage, a much clearer chance of victory in the battleground states. And so this time, it's definitely a lot closer than 2020, likely even closer than 2016. Makes sense because the electoral vote count was the same in 2016 and 2020, but even closer, I think, than some elections we've seen that were quite close. Years like 2004 and potentially even closer than the year 2000. So as we go through these 244 remaining toss-up electoral votes, let's make a note in keeping in mind that a lot of these states are states that Kamala Harris and Donald Trump at this point, a month out, probably aren't going to lose if they're characterized as likely and potentially at this point even lean. Meaning that if, for example, Kamala Harris is in the advantage in a state like Colorado by a lean margin, chances are there isn't enough time for Donald Trump in the final 3 to 4 weeks to change that, barring a major October surprise, which might happen, might not happen, but we're going to go ahead and wait and see. So 244 electoral votes. Let's start off by characterizing the likely states. These are states that we know each political party is going to win by a margin of anywhere between 5 to 15 points. What does this mean? States like South Carolina, states like Alaska, which Republicans can rely on. But Democrats do narrow down that margin and have been narrowing down that margin in recent elections. South Carolina will probably see Donald Trump win it by 12 to 13 points. Alaska, we're probably going to see Republicans win it by anywhere from 8 to 9 points. These states have gotten closer, but Donald Trump's still going to win them, and Democrats don't contest them for a good reason because they aren't really that competitive, just slightly more so than some of the other states that we characterize as safe. This includes states like Iowa, includes states like Ohio, which Donald Trump won into both 2016 and 2020. By over 8 points each. We don't see that changing too much this cycle. I can imagine Iowa narrowing down to a 6-7 point margin. Previously, I would have said 4 or 5 points. I think we've seen Donald Trump really rebound in that state. Same thing in Ohio, going from what in theory could have been a 5-6 point margin, somewhere around 6, 7, 8 points. So back to that part, I will say too, one thing that we know about elections, Democrats consolidate their support in September. Republicans consolidate their support in October, which is why in years like 2012, perfect example, anyone who's looking at there, you can look back. 2012, Mitt Romney led almost every single day of the national popular vote margin when it came down to the polls in the entire month of October. And in that final week, Obama came back on top. In the swing states, Mitt Romney led in a number of swing states every single day of October between October 1st and October 31st. From the beginning to Halloween, through Hurricane Sandy, through all these different things, Mitt Romney maintained an advantage. Why did that matter? Well, because it looked like Romney was going to win if you were just to look at the October numbers. And this is also to say, when you're looking at the polls right now, I will caution, this is not saying that, Donald Trump is leading in all of the battleground states. He's down in Pennsylvania, he's down in Wisconsin, he's down in Nevada, he's down in Michigan. But here's the margins that are really interesting. Democrat +1 in Pennsylvania, Democrat +1 in Wisconsin, Democrat +1 in Nevada, Republican +1 in Georgia, Democrat +1 in Michigan, North Carolina, Republican +1, Republican +1 in Arizona. Every one of the 7 battleground states, I kid you not, is Democrat or Republican +1 at most. So this election really is close, right? Which is why it sort of just foreshadows how narrow some of these states are really going to be. Very interesting, but ultimately a very, very close and competitive race. Back to the point though, Iowa, Ohio, South Carolina, Alaska, these join our group as the likely Republican states. There's also a likely Republican district, both Maine and Nebraska vote by congressional district as well as a statewide vote. Maine's 2nd district is likely, no pun intended, to go to Donald Trump. So that's 149 electoral votes for Donald Trump, 113 in the safe category, about 36 in the likely category. Let's continue onwards as we look at the Democratic states, because this is where Democrats really build up this firewall that puts them to roughly even with that of Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. This includes states like Virginia and New Hampshire and Maine and Minnesota and Colorado and New Mexico and Nebraska's 2nd district. It's all of these states in the 2nd district that bring Kamala Harris to 226 electoral votes in this cycle at bare minimum. There doesn't seem to be a circumstance in which Donald Trump wins more than, 163 plus 149, wins more than 312 electoral votes. That isn't going to happen. Kamala Harris at baseline will be at 226. I fully expect if we're just going to go down by margin, what would I say? I already discussed South Carolina, Ohio, Iowa, Alaska, Virginia, 9-10 points. Minnesota, 7-8 points. Colorado, 13-14 points. New Mexico, 10-11 points. Or honestly, even 9-10 points. New Hampshire, probably around 7-8 points. These states really aren't going to shift too heavily from the 2020 election, and that's good news for the Democratic Party when it comes down to these states because Democrats did very well in these battleground states. In terms of where Donald Trump and J.D. Vance make up the margin, well, we have 2 major states that we have yet to characterize. Now, I sort of misled you for a moment. I said that I was done characterizing the likely Republican states, but I actually have one more at this point that I would say I am comfortable characterizing as a likely Republican state, no longer from the lean Republican column. So this is a shift in favor of Donald Trump, and that comes from the state of Florida. Now, a lot of this has been informed by recent data points we've seen coming out of the state, which largely makes sense. With that standard convention we've known in some of these battleground states, at least, a good example is that in September, again, Democrats consolidate, Republicans consolidate in October. Look at Mitt Romney, too. Through Election Day, he led in Florida because he built up a lead in the polls that by the time the average had been brought down to being more in favor of Obama, Mitt Romney's lead was high enough in October because of that consolidation that wasn't mirrored on Election Day, that we ended up seeing a bit of a fall off for Mitt Romney, but not enough that allowed Obama to take the lead in the polls. The polls were dubbed wrong. The prediction model said that Florida would go red. Florida did not go red. Barack Obama won the state. But to the point of the 2024 election, Donald Trump will win Florida probably by 5 to 6 points. I was more on the end that he would win it by 4 to 5 points, which is a difference of a characterization, seems more major than it is, but Florida right now, I'd say Donald Trump wins by a likely margin. But again, back to that point, we no longer have states that as of right now, I would feel comfortable characterizing as lean Democrat. So take away all of those states, we said lean Democrat before. For the lean Republican column, I would say it really only fits to one state at this point, and that is the battleground state of Texas. This is a state that I do think, despite some new data showing it being a 6-point margin for Trump, I do think it's going to narrow up. What I remember from 2016 is that Texas was expected to be more conservative than it actually was. What I remember from 2018, same deal. In 2020, the polls were a bit off in Texas, but a lot of the polling firms in 2022 ended up overestimating Republican support yet again. And so what I do think is the general trend line here for Democrats, with the exception of the 2020 election, the numbers here for Republicans end up being overestimated in terms of what the polls say. And beyond that point too, what we're likely going to see is that Ted Cruz brings down Donald Trump. The benefit for Donald Trump in 2020 was he was running alongside Senator John Cornyn, who outperformed him by roughly 4 points statewide. When you have someone like Ted Cruz who's narrowing up a race and involving $50, $60, $70, $80 million for any statewide campaign, Democrats did not do that in 2020. They didn't invest it from the presidential level. They did not invest it from the Senate level. National Democrats are making a play for Texas for the first time since 2002 in the Senate race. There is a residual effect in favor of Joe Biden and the Democrats in the state of Texas. And with that being said, I do think Texas narrows up to being a 4 to 5 point state in favor of Donald Trump nonetheless. So in the final 7 battleground states, Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, going from left to right, we're looking at battleground states that make a difference on this election cycle and are so exceptionally close. 93 electoral votes. Let's go through it. Let's talk it through. Let's figure out which states are going to which candidates, because I don't really think it's going to shock you that much, but this race is so incredibly close. I do want to say, I do think that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance hold on to the state that Donald Trump and Mike Pence won back in 2020. I think North Carolina is going to be closer. I equally think Donald Trump's going to win it. We just haven't seen the major inroads in the polling data, fundraising data, and overall ground game that's necessary to win in North Carolina at this point. Do I think it could happen? 3 weeks out, the answer is yes. But when we get to a point where these states become more solidified, 2 weeks out, 1 week out, I become less confident here that Kamala Harris can turn it around. With that being said, every single state we are going to characterize from this point onward is in the tilt column, meaning I expect the margins here for both parties to be less than 1%, which means just a standard error, anything that's normal, not even above average, but normal, could completely change the direction of this election. And I hate that this is the way that this election is going, but that's really how close it actually is. I'd also say that the neighboring state of Georgia is going to be a tilt Republican state. I do not know the direct impacts of Hurricane Helene on the electorate. And what I mean by that is that I'm not trying to take away from the very real natural disaster devastation that we have seen exhibited. But what I am going to say is that everything matters in politics, and voters are already talking about in North Carolina and Georgia whether they agree or disagree with the response from their state government, with the response from their local government, from the response from the federal government. And it really does break down by party lines. Democrats are saying, you're doing a good job. Republicans are saying, we don't have enough money. It's a very interesting dynamic here that ultimately I do not know how it will impact the overall state of the race in these states. But I will say, at this point, I do think Donald Trump maintains his advantage from my 1 week ago prediction, 1 month ago prediction, that North Carolina and Georgia are tilt Republican states. So that brings Donald Trump and J.D. Vance up to 251 electoral votes. Let's go through the remaining states. Well, when it comes down to the state of Arizona, I still believe that Donald Trump holds this narrow advantage. Do I think Democrats could turn out surprisingly on election day due to the abortion referendum, the involvement of Democratic organizations on college campuses? Absolutely. Do I think Republicans made a mistake in choosing Turning Point USA as their get out the vote effort in the state of Arizona? Absolutely. But at the same time, I reaffirm and believe at its core that Arizona is a state that Donald Trump maintains an advantage in because of how narrow it was in 2020. It's a border state. It's a state that cares a lot about the issue of immigration, the southern border, etc. I do think that we've seen some ground lost for Democrats amongst Latino voters. Is the perfect combination of what we're seeing in some of these other battleground states for Democrats to lose in Arizona. But with that being said, I still think Kamala Harris holds her own in Nevada. I don't think much has changed over the past week, and the data we've seen out of the state actually is quite promising, pretty consistently and in the advantage for Kamala Harris and the Democrats, which we actually don't see historically. Trump led on election day in 2016 in the polls in Nevada, it was wrong. Trump led on election day in Nevada in 2020 in the polls, it was wrong. So not always is there a Republican overestimation, but in fact, the majority of the time, since 2012, there's been an underestimation of Democratic support in that battleground state. And when it comes down to the Rust Belt, These are really the 3 states that are going to make a major, major difference. And I will say this. As of right now, there is likely an equal chance that Donald Trump wins all 3 of these states or loses all 3 of these states. Do I think, as I did adamantly a month ago, believe that these 3 states will vote together? Not necessarily. I do think there's a circumstance in which Democrats win Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and lose Michigan, and I think we're getting closer to that being a possible reality based on some of the data we're seeing. Do I think it's possible the Democrats win Wisconsin and Michigan and lose Pennsylvania? Absolutely. The Republican coordinated campaign is spending over $150 million in Pennsylvania compared to just $40 million in Wisconsin. Obviously a lot of money. I'd love to have that someday. But, when you're looking at it from the perspective of where the investments are being made for the voter, Pennsylvania is the highest rate by far across the nation for the GOP. With all of this being said, based on the data we've seen recently, based on the voter registration numbers, the early voting numbers in Pennsylvania, the requested ballots across the states, I do think that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz have the narrowest of advantages in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, but it really is down to the wire. These 3 states right now are in the Harris camp. Arguably so is Nevada. Should something change in the next week, they could all be in the Trump camp. These states really are going to be some of the closest that we will see in this election and likely for many elections to come. It was already close in 2020. Wisconsin was 0.6. Pennsylvania was 1.2. Michigan was 2.8. I don't think we're going to see anything like that. I think all 3 of these states will be decided by a margin of less than half a point on election night, and they'll be very close. Democrats have lost ground amongst Arab Americans in Michigan. They've lost ground amongst black voters in Milwaukee. They've lost ground amongst black voters in Pennsylvania. Does that mean it can be counteracted? Absolutely. We've seen surges in support amongst suburban voters, educated college voters, white voters across the nation. Is that enough? We'll wait and see. But this election cycle is going to come down to the wire, and this prediction here should really emphasize that when it comes down to these battleground states, as much as we'd like to know how they're going to go, it wouldn't be shocking if they moved in the other direction. They are so painstakingly close in a way they weren't in 2020, in a way they typically aren't in presidential elections, and this cycle just really is going to throw us all for a loop on election night. We might see some shocks, we might not, but it really comes down to the wire. Kamala Harris at 276 to Donald Trump's 262, Democrats still in the advantage, but hanging by a thread. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter at the bottom left of the screen, top left of the screen. There's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.